I'm Jessica Martinez, and 3 months ago, I thought the worst pain I'd ever experienced was watching my brother spiral into addiction. I was wrong. The worst pain was the sound of my own ribs cracking when he slammed me against my garage wall because I wouldn't hand over another $1,000. But what happened next in that emergency room changed everything. And I mean everything, in ways I never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the sun-baked suburbs of Phoenix, Michael and I were practically inseparable, despite our 3-year age gap. Our childhood was painted in shades of desert gold and endless blue skies, where summer days stretched like warm honey and winter meant perfect weather for hiking the trails of South Mountain. Our parents, Robert and Linda Martinez, built their lives around the simple philosophy that family came first, work came second, and everything else could wait. Dad worked construction for the city, his weathered hands always smelling of concrete dust and strong coffee, while Mom managed the front desk at a dental office, coming home each evening with stories about difficult patients and office drama that made us laugh until our sides hurt. Our ranch-style house in Tempe wasn't anything fancy, but it was ours, complete with a backyard pool that became the neighborhood gathering spot every scorching summer. Michael was the kind of big brother every little sister dreams of having. He taught me how to ride my bike without training wheels, patiently running alongside me in the desert heat until I finally found my balance. When kids at school teased me about my thick glasses or the hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit right, Michael would appear like some kind of guardian angel, not with fists or harsh words, but with that easy smile and natural charisma that made everyone want to be his friend. He had this incredible gift with anything mechanical. While other kids were playing video games, Michael could be found in our garage, taking apart lawnmowers, fixing neighbors' bicycles, or helping Dad with weekend projects that always seemed to require more skill than either of them actually possessed. By the time he turned 16, there wasn't an engine in our neighborhood that Michael couldn't diagnose and repair, often better than it had run when it was new. Our weekend adventures became the stuff of family legend. Michael would pile me and our cousins into Dad's old pickup truck, and we'd drive out to the desert beyond Ahwatukee, where the city lights couldn't reach and the stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds. He'd bring his telescope, a garage sale find that he'd somehow restored to perfect working condition, and spend hours showing us constellations, telling stories he'd read in library books about ancient myths and distant galaxies. Those desert nights taught me that Michael saw wonder in everything. He'd point out how the saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels against the horizon, or how the distant mountains changed color as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple. "Jessica," he'd say, his voice full of excitement, "look how beautiful this world is. There's so much to see, so much to discover. Promise me you'll never stop looking for the beauty in things." High school brought changes that seemed natural at the time but would later feel like warning signs I should have recognized. Michael's grades started slipping during his junior year. Not dramatically, but enough that Mom would purse her lips when report cards arrived. He claimed he was just bored with school, that he learned better with his hands than from textbooks, and honestly, we all believed him. His mechanical abilities had grown so sophisticated that neighbors were paying him real money to fix their cars, and Dad often joked that Michael would probably earn more as a mechanic than most people with college degrees. The summer before Michael's senior year, he got a job at Ricci's Auto Repair Shop, a family-owned business that had been serving the Phoenix area for over 30 years. Tony Ricci took one look at Michael's work and hired him on the spot, promising him full-time employment after graduation. For the first time in months, Michael seemed genuinely excited about his future, talking endlessly about learning advanced diagnostics, maybe eventually opening his own shop, building something meaningful with his skills. Meanwhile, I was discovering my own path through the structured world of academics and extracurricular activities. My junior year brought acceptance into the National Honor Society, a part-time job at the local library, and growing certainty that I wanted to pursue nursing. The idea of helping people during their most vulnerable moments, of combining scientific knowledge with genuine compassion, felt like a calling rather than just a career choice. Michael graduated without fanfare in May, immediately transitioning to full-time work at Ricci's. The transformation was remarkable. He'd come home each evening, covered in grease, but glowing with satisfaction, eager to share stories about complicated repairs he'd mastered or compliments he'd received from grateful customers. Tony Ricci became like a second father to him, teaching not just technical skills but business principles, customer service, and professional pride. That autumn, as I started my senior year, Michael moved into a small apartment near the shop, claiming he wanted independence and shorter commute times. The apartment wasn't much, a one-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better decades, but Michael transformed it into something comfortable and uniquely his. He painted the walls in desert sunset colors, hung framed photographs of our family adventures, and converted the tiny second bedroom into a workshop where he could pursue personal projects. Our Sunday family dinners continued as sacred tradition, with Michael arriving promptly at noon, usually bearing some small gift for Mom or a tool he'd restored for Dad. He'd regale us with stories from the shop, his eyes bright with enthusiasm as he described challenging repairs or satisfied customers. Those dinners felt like proof that our family bond remained unbreakable, that growing up and moving out didn't have to mean growing apart. I graduated valedictorian the following spring, earning a full scholarship to Arizona State University's nursing program. The celebration party Mom threw in our backyard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Became one of those perfect family moments that you wish you could preserve forever. Michael gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes, talking about how proud he was of his genius little sister, and how he knew I'd change the world one patient at a time. College life suited me perfectly. The structured environment, challenging coursework, and clear progression toward meaningful goals felt like natural extensions of who I'd always been. My clinical rotations began during sophomore year, introducing me to the intense, fast-paced world of hospital medicine that would eventually become my professional home. Each semester brought new knowledge, greater confidence, and stronger conviction that I'd chosen the right path. Michael seemed equally settled in his chosen direction. Tony Ricci had promoted him to lead mechanic, recognizing skills that had continued developing at an impressive pace. Michael had earned certifications in hybrid vehicle repair, advanced diagnostics, and customer service excellence. His reputation in the community grew steadily, with customers specifically requesting him for their most valuable or problematic vehicles. During my junior year, I met Daniel Chen in a coffee shop near campus, where we both studied most evenings. He was completing his education degree, planning to teach high school history, drawn to the profession by the same desire to make a positive difference that had attracted me to nursing. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Daniel fit seamlessly into our family dynamics. Dad appreciated his respectful manner and genuine interest in construction techniques. Mom loved his thoughtful questions about her work and his offers to help with holiday preparations. Michael initially teased me about dating a book nerd, but quickly developed real friendship with Daniel, bonding over their shared love of hiking and Daniel's surprising mechanical aptitude. The first crack in our family foundation appeared so gradually that none of us recognized it as significant. Michael began missing occasional Sunday dinners, usually calling with legitimate-sounding excuses about emergency repairs or scheduling conflicts. His contributions to family gatherings when he did attend seemed slightly forced, as though he was performing happiness rather than genuinely experiencing it. Mom noticed first, as mothers always do. "Michael seems tired lately," she'd mentioned to me during our weekly phone calls. Not just physically tired, but tired in his soul, if that makes sense. I dismissed her concerns as typical maternal worry, pointing out that mechanical work was physically demanding, and that Michael had always been prone to throwing himself completely into projects. During Christmas break of my senior year, the changes became impossible to ignore. Michael arrived at family celebrations later than usual, left earlier than normal, and spent most of the time checking his phone with an urgency that seemed completely out of character. His usual enthusiasm for family stories and inside jokes was replaced by distracted politeness that created awkward silences where laughter had always flowed naturally. The gifts he brought seemed expensive and impulsive rather than thoughtful and personal. Mom received an elaborate jewelry set that wasn't her style, Dad got high-end power tools he'd never mentioned wanting, and my present was a designer purse that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When Dad questioned the extravagance, Michael became defensive, insisting that he was finally earning good money and wanted to spoil his family. New Year's Eve brought our first real argument in years. The family had gathered at my parents' house for our traditional evening of board games, homemade tamales, and watching the countdown from Times Square. Michael arrived 3 hours late. His explanations vague and contradictory, his behavior agitated in ways I'd never seen before. He couldn't sit still for more than a few minutes, constantly excusing himself to step outside for fresh air or to check on something in his truck. His hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking, and he kept wiping his nose with the back of his hand, a nervous habit from childhood that had disappeared years ago. When Dad suggested starting a card game, Michael exploded over nothing, claiming we were all treating him like a child, that he had responsibilities none of us understood, that maybe he should just leave if his presence was such an inconvenience. The outburst lasted only a few minutes, but it left everyone stunned and confused. Michael had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts with humor and easy charm. He apologized profusely, blaming work stress and claiming he hadn't been sleeping well. We accepted his explanation because we loved him, and because the alternative was unthinkable. After he left that night, driving away with aggressive acceleration that squealed his tires, the four of us sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in private worries we weren't ready to voice aloud. January brought my final semester of nursing school, including intensive clinical rotations that demanded every ounce of my attention and energy. The demanding schedule provided convenient excuse to avoid dwelling on Michael's concerning behavior, though quiet moments in hospital corridors often found my mind wandering to his hollow eyes and shaking hands. My engagement to Daniel that February should have been pure celebration, but Michael's reaction cast shadows over what should have been joyous family news. While Mom cried happy tears and Dad offered Daniel a firm handshake and genuine welcome, Michael's congratulations felt perfunctory, delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. The engagement party Mom insisted on throwing became another uncomfortable family gathering. Michael arrived on time but left abruptly during the cake cutting, claiming a work emergency that seemed suspiciously convenient. Several relatives asked me privately if he was okay, commenting on his dramatic weight loss and the nervous energy that radiated from him like heat from summer pavement. Spring semester concluded with my successful completion of nursing school and immediate acceptance into the intensive care unit at Banner Desert Medical Center. The position represented everything I'd worked toward, an opportunity to use my skills in one of the hospital's most challenging and rewarding departments. My orientation period began in May, introducing me to the controlled chaos of critical care medicine. Michael's attendance at my graduation ceremony was sporadic and distracted. He arrived late, left during the reception, and seemed unable to focus on conversations longer than a few minutes. His congratulations speech at the family dinner felt rehearsed rather than heartfelt, lacking the genuine warmth that had always characterized his support for my achievements. The summer of my career beginning marked the start of Michael's visible decline. His apartment, once meticulously maintained, became cluttered and dirty when I stopped by unannounced one afternoon. Empty energy drink cans covered every surface. Dirty clothes were scattered across furniture, and the air held a stale smell that spoke of poor hygiene and inadequate nutrition. Michael's explanation was dismissive and irritated. He was working longer hours, taking on more challenging projects, didn't have time for house beautification. When I offered to help clean or bring groceries, he became aggressively defensive, accusing me of judging his lifestyle choices and treating him like a child who couldn't manage his own affairs. Work at the hospital began consuming most of my mental and emotional energy. The intensive care unit demanded split-second decisions, perfect attention to detail, and emotional resilience that took months to develop. My patients' lives literally depended on my competence and vigilance, responsibility that felt both terrifying and deeply meaningful. Daniel and I began planning our wedding for the following spring, a process that should have been exciting but felt complicated by Michael's increasing unreliability. He agreed to be in the wedding party, but seemed incapable of following through on simple commitments like scheduling tuxedo fittings or attending planning meetings. By October, Michael's deterioration had become impossible to ignore or rationalize. He'd missed 3 consecutive family dinners, stopped returning phone calls promptly, and looked genuinely unhealthy the few times we saw him. His clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame, his skin had acquired a grayish pallor, and dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and poor nutrition. The confrontation that would change everything began with a phone call at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. Michael's voice sounded desperate and shaky as he begged me to meet him at a 24-hour diner near his apartment. Something in his tone made refusal impossible, despite the fact that I had to work the next morning and Daniel had an early teaching conference. The Michael who met me at that fluorescent-lit diner bore little resemblance to the confident, capable man I'd grown up idolizing. His hands shook as he wrapped them around his coffee cup, his eyes darted constantly toward the windows and entrance, and his conversation jumped frantically between topics without apparent connection or logic. He needed money, he explained, just a temporary loan to cover some unexpected expenses. His rent was past due, his truck needed major repairs, and he was behind on several bills. The amounts he mentioned seemed manageable, and his desperation was so complete that agreeing felt like the only compassionate response. I drove to an ATM and withdrew $800, money I'd been saving for wedding expenses, but that seemed insignificant compared to Michael's obvious crisis. His relief was so profound that tears actually formed in his eyes as he folded the bills into his wallet with trembling fingers. "Jessica," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you saved my life tonight. I promise I'll pay you back as soon as Tony gives me my next check. This is just temporary, just until I get caught up on everything." That promise would prove to be the first of many lies, each one more elaborate and desperate than the last, leading us down a path toward a confrontation that would shatter our family and leave me broken and bleeding on my own garage floor. That $800 disappeared within a week. When I called to check on Michael's situation, his phone went straight to voicemail for 3 days straight. When he finally answered, his voice carried that same desperate edge I'd heard at the diner. But now it was accompanied by elaborate explanations about delayed paychecks and unexpected car troubles that sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. The nursing profession had taught me to recognize patterns, to notice when stories didn't align with observable evidence, to trust my instincts when something felt fundamentally wrong. Every fiber of my professional training was sending alarm signals about Michael's behavior, but my heart refused to accept what my mind was beginning to suspect. Working in the intensive care unit meant dealing with medical emergencies around the clock, life and death decisions that required absolute focus and emotional stability. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could maintain perfect composure while managing ventilators, administering critical medications, and comforting families during their darkest hours. Yet I felt completely helpless when it came to understanding what was happening to my own brother. Daniel noticed the change in my demeanor before I was willing to acknowledge it myself. During our quiet evenings together, planning wedding details or simply enjoying each other's company, I'd find myself distracted by thoughts of Michael's hollow eyes and trembling hands. Daniel would catch me staring into space, lost in worry that I couldn't articulate because doing so would make it real. "Jessica," he said one evening as we sat on our small patio, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and gold, "you've been carrying something heavy for weeks now. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." His gentle patience broke through my stubborn denial, and the story of Michael's midnight plea for money came pouring out in a rush of words and suppressed tears. Daniel listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that helped me organize my scattered concerns into something resembling coherent worry. "What does your gut tell you?" he asked when I had finished recounting every strange interaction and concerning observation from recent months. Not your love for him or your hope for the best outcome, but your actual instincts as someone who knows him better than anyone. The question forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. My gut told me that Michael was in serious trouble, that his problems went far beyond temporary financial difficulties or work-related stress. Something fundamental had changed in him, something that money alone couldn't fix. December brought a series of increasingly desperate phone calls. Michael needed $300 for utility bills that were about to be shut off. 2 weeks later, he required $500 for truck repairs that would otherwise cost him his job. Each request came with detailed explanations and heartfelt promises of repayment, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. My wedding dress fittings, cake tastings, and venue consultations began feeling surreal against the backdrop of Michael's escalating crisis. How could I focus on choosing between buttercream and fondant frosting when my brother was clearly spiraling towards some kind of catastrophe? The cognitive dissonance of planning the happiest day of my life while watching Michael's deterioration created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that affected every aspect of my daily routine. Mom began calling me more frequently, usually late at night when Dad was asleep and she could speak freely about her growing concerns. Her observations aligned perfectly with my own worries, creating a picture of decline that neither of us wanted to acknowledge fully. "He came for dinner last Sunday," she told me during one of these whispered conversations, "but he couldn't sit still through the entire meal. He kept checking his phone, excusing himself to go outside, picking at his food without really eating. When your father asked about work, Michael's answers were vague and defensive. Something's very wrong, Jessica, but I don't know how to help him." The holidays that year felt like elaborate performances, where everyone pretended everything was normal while privately harboring the same unspoken fears. Michael's Christmas gifts were expensive again, but this time they seemed desperate rather than generous, as though he was trying to purchase forgiveness for sins we hadn't yet identified. His behavior during family gatherings had become predictably erratic. He'd arrive late with reasonable-sounding excuses, participate in conversations with forced enthusiasm that felt hollow and strained, then leave abruptly, citing work emergencies that became increasingly implausible. The Michael we all remembered seemed to appear in brief flashes, moments when his genuine smile would break through the facade, only to disappear again behind the anxious stranger he'd become. New Year's Eve passed without his presence entirely. When Mom called his apartment, the phone rang without answer. When Dad drove by his complex, Michael's truck wasn't in its assigned space. He surfaced 3 days later with apologies and explanations about picking up extra shifts at the shop, but Tony Ricci had already called Dad to ask if Michael was feeling all right because he'd seemed distracted and unreliable lately. That phone call from Tony marked the first time Michael's problems had extended beyond our family circle into his professional life. Tony had been more than an employer to Michael. He'd been a mentor, father figure, and friend who'd invested years in developing Michael's skills and character. If Tony was expressing concerns, the situation had progressed beyond what any of us had imagined. January brought my final wedding preparations alongside Michael's most dramatic deterioration yet. He missed my bridal shower entirely, failing to respond to multiple calls and texts until 2 days afterward, when he claimed food poisoning had kept him bedridden. His absence from such an important family event felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than I'd expected. The venue coordinator, florist, and caterer all required final confirmations and payments during those weeks, decisions that should have filled me with excitement, but instead highlighted Michael's increasing unreliability. How could I plan seating arrangements when I wasn't sure my own brother would show up? How could I choose music for the father-daughter dance substitute when I didn't know if he'd be capable of participating? February brought the most alarming incident yet. Michael called me at work during my night shift, his voice so distorted by panic and incoherent rambling that I initially thought he was having some kind of medical emergency. He needed $1,500 immediately, he explained through rapid, gasping sentences, because he'd made a mistake with some money that wasn't his, and people were looking for him. And if he didn't fix it right away, something terrible would happen. The call came through while I was monitoring 3 critical patients, their lives dependent on my constant attention and quick responses to changing conditions. The juxtaposition of Michael's crisis against my professional responsibilities created an impossible situation where I couldn't fully address either concern adequately. "Michael," I said, trying to inject calm authority into my voice while keeping one eye on the cardiac monitors around me. "Slow down and tell me exactly what's happening. What money, what people, what kind of trouble are you in?" His explanations made no sense. He talked about borrowing money for truck repairs, then mentioned gambling debts, then claimed someone at work had accused him of stealing tools. The stories contradicted each other within minutes. creating a web of confusion that made it impossible to understand the actual nature of his crisis. "I can't talk about the details over the phone," he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just trust me, Jessica. I need the money tonight, or everything falls apart. You're the only person I can turn to." The desperation in his voice was so complete, so different from anything I'd ever heard from him, that agreeing felt like the only option that wouldn't result in catastrophic consequences. I promised to meet him after my shift ended, bringing whatever cash I could gather on short notice. The ATM withdrawal limit forced me to visit 3 different machines, draining my checking account and dipping into savings that Daniel and I had earmarked for our honeymoon. Each transaction felt like a step deeper into something I didn't understand, but couldn't escape, a pattern of enabling that went against every logical instinct I possessed. Michael met me in the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy, his appearance so dramatically changed that I barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 20 pounds since Christmas, his clothes hanging like empty sacks on his skeletal frame. His skin had acquired a waxy, yellowish tint that spoke of poor nutrition and worse health habits. Most alarming were his eyes, which darted constantly between my face and the surrounding area, as though he expected threats to emerge from the shadows. "Thank you," he said, clutching the envelope of cash with hands that shook so violently he could barely maintain his grip. "You saved my life again, Jessica. I promise this is the last time I'm getting everything straightened out, getting back on track. This just buys me time to fix everything properly." His promises felt hollow even as he spoke them, delivered with the desperate sincerity of someone who wanted to believe his own lies. As he drove away that night, tires squealing against the asphalt in his haste to escape, I stood in that empty parking lot wondering how many more times I'd hear those same empty assurances. The $1,500 lasted exactly 9 days. When Michael called again, this time needing $2,000 for reasons that sounded even less believable than before, I finally found the courage to say no. The conversation that followed revealed depths of manipulation and emotional blackmail I'd never imagined my brother capable of employing. He reminded me of every favor he'd ever done for me, every time he'd protected me during childhood, every sacrifice he'd made for our family's happiness. When guilt tactics failed to produce the desired result, he shifted to anger, accusing me of abandoning him when he needed me most, of caring more about wedding expenses than his survival. "I thought family meant something to you," he said, his voice cold in ways that chilled me to the bone. "I thought blood was thicker than money, but I guess I was wrong about who you really are." The call ended with him hanging up on me, leaving me shaking with adrenaline and confusion. This person who'd spoken to me with such calculated cruelty bore no resemblance to the brother who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd shown me constellations in the desert sky, who'd celebrated every achievement in my life with genuine pride and joy. Daniel found me crying on our couch an hour later, the phone still clutched in my hand as though I was hoping Michael would call back with apologies and explanations that would restore some sense of normalcy to our relationship. Instead of offering empty reassurances or quick solutions, Daniel simply held me while I grieved for the brother I was beginning to realize I'd already lost. "What do I do?" I asked him through tears that felt like they'd never stop coming. "How do I help someone who's becoming a stranger? How do I save someone who doesn't want to be saved?" Daniel's response would stay with me through everything that followed. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to enable their destruction, even when saying no feels like abandonment. You're not responsible for fixing whatever's wrong with Michael, but you are responsible for protecting yourself and our future together. March brought wedding invitations that had to be addressed and mailed without any certainty about whether the guest of honor in my family would be present or capable of participating. The awkward conversations with relatives who asked about Michael's role in the ceremony became exercises in creative ambiguity, deflecting their concerns while hiding my own growing fears about his stability. My work at the hospital provided blessed distraction from family chaos, but even there, Michael's situation intruded on my professional focus. Treating patients with obvious signs of substance abuse created uncomfortable parallels that I tried desperately to ignore. The glassy eyes, trembling hands, and desperate behaviors I observed in some patients looked increasingly familiar, resembling details I'd noticed in my own brother but refused to acknowledge. One particularly difficult shift involved a young man brought to the emergency room after a drug overdose, his sister crying in the waiting room while police officers asked questions about his recent behavior and associates, watching her try to explain warning signs she'd missed, and opportunities for intervention she'd ignored felt like staring into a mirror that reflected possibilities I couldn't bear to consider. The patient survived, but the conversation I overheard between his sister and the social worker haunted me for days afterward. "I kept giving him money," she said through tears. "I thought I was helping, but the counselor says I was just funding his addiction. How was I supposed to know the difference between helping and enabling? He's my brother. I love him." Those words echoed through my mind during quiet moments, forcing me to confront questions I'd been avoiding about my own responses to Michael's increasingly desperate requests for financial assistance. Had my attempts to help actually made his situation worse? Was my love for him blinding me to the reality of what he'd become? April arrived with final wedding preparations that should have been joyful milestones, but instead felt overshadowed by Michael's conspicuous absence from every planning activity. He missed the rehearsal dinner completely, claiming work obligations that Tony Ricci later contradicted when Dad called to verify the story. His empty chair at the family table served as a visible reminder that our family was fracturing in ways none of us fully understood. The morning of my wedding dawned with perfect Arizona weather, clear skies and comfortable temperatures that promised ideal conditions for our outdoor ceremony. As my bridesmaids helped me into my dress and the photographer captured candid moments of preparation, I found myself checking my phone obsessively for messages from Michael. He'd promised to be there early, to help with setup and to fulfill his role as my only brother during the most important day of my life. When noon arrived without any word from him, Mom began making discreet phone calls while trying to maintain the festive atmosphere that such occasions demanded. "He's not answering," she reported quietly during a brief moment alone. "I drove by his apartment this morning, but his truck wasn't there. I called Tony, but the shop is closed today for your wedding." The ceremony proceeded beautifully despite the glaring absence of my brother from the wedding party lineup. Dad walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Daniel's family embraced me with warmth that temporarily filled the emotional void Michael's absence had created, and our vows were exchanged under a perfect desert sky that reminded me of countless family adventures from happier times. But during the reception, as families mingled and celebrated our union, the questions about Michael's whereabouts became impossible to deflect or ignore. Relatives who hadn't seen him in months asked pointed questions about his health, his job, his general well-being, that forced me to acknowledge how completely he'd withdrawn from our extended family network. "Where's Michael?" became the refrain of the evening, each inquiry requiring careful responses that balanced honesty with discretion. I found myself making excuses for behavior I didn't understand, protecting a brother who'd chosen to abandon the most important day of my life without explanation or apology. The honeymoon that followed provided temporary escape from family concerns, but even in paradise, Michael's absence felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Daniel's patience with my distracted moods and sudden emotional crashes demonstrated the depth of his commitment to our marriage, but I knew the situation was creating stress that no newlywed couple should have to endure. We returned from our trip to find 17 missed calls from Michael on my phone, each voicemail more desperate and incoherent than the last. His messages ranged from tearful apologies for missing the wedding to angry accusations about my selfishness in getting married while he was going through the worst time of his life. The final message, left at 3 a.m, 2 days before our return, consisted mostly of sobbing and fragmented sentences about being sorry, about everything being ruined, about people who were going to hurt him if he couldn't fix his mistakes. The raw desperation in his voice was so complete that I called him immediately upon hearing it, terrified that I might be too late to prevent some kind of catastrophic outcome. His phone went straight to voicemail. When I drove to his apartment complex, the manager informed me that Michael had been evicted the previous week for non-payment of rent and disturbing other tenants with loud arguments and strange visitors at all hours of the night. He left forwarding address, the manager said with obvious relief at Michael's departure. "But honestly, lady, your brother was becoming a real problem around here. The kind of people coming to see him, the noise complaints, the way he looked the last few months. I was getting ready to call the police if he hadn't left on his own." Standing in the parking lot of Michael's former home, staring up at the empty windows of the apartment where he'd once built a comfortable life. I finally acknowledged the truth I'd been denying for months. My brother was addicted to drugs, probably had been for longer than any of us realized, and all my attempts to help him with money and emotional support had accomplished nothing except enabling his continued destruction. The realization felt like a physical blow, stealing my breath and leaving me dizzy with implications I wasn't ready to process. The Michael I'd grown up loving, the protective big brother who'd shaped so much of my childhood happiness, had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of manipulation, abandonment, and behaviors that contradicted everything I thought I knew about his character. That evening, Daniel held me while I grieved not just for Michael's current situation, but for the loss of illusions that had sustained me through months of increasingly desperate attempts to save someone who might already be beyond saving. The brother I'd always trusted to be there when I needed him most had chosen drugs over family, addiction over the relationships that had once defined his identity. "What happens now?" I asked Daniel through tears that felt like they contained years of accumulated heartbreak and disappointed hope. "Now we figure out how to love him without destroying ourselves," he replied. "And we pray that someday he chooses recovery before it's too late." Neither of us could have imagined how much worse things would become before they got better, or that the path toward Michael's rock bottom would lead through my own physical pain and a confrontation that would change everything forever. The weeks following our return from honeymoon passed in an eerie quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. Michael had completely disappeared from our family's radar. No phone calls, no sightings around his old neighborhood, no contact with anyone in our extended circle of relatives and friends. For the first time in months, my phone remained silent of his desperate pleas for money, but instead of relief, this absence filled me with a dread that grew stronger each day. Daniel and I settled into our new rhythm as a married couple, establishing routines that should have felt comforting and stable. Our small townhouse in Chandler became a sanctuary where we could pretend, at least for a few hours each evening, that family crisis wasn't constantly lurking at the edges of our consciousness. Daniel would prepare dinner while I unwound from my hospital shifts, and we'd sit on our tiny patio watching the desert sunset paint familiar patterns across the sky. But even these peaceful moments couldn't completely banish my worry about Michael's whereabouts and condition. During quiet conversations over morning coffee or late evening talks before bed, Daniel and I would find ourselves speculating about what had become of him, where he might be living, whether he was even still in the Phoenix area. The not knowing felt almost worse than dealing with his constant crises, because at least when he was calling for money, we knew he was alive. My work at Banner Desert Medical Center provided structure and purpose that helped manage the underlying anxiety about Michael's situation. The intensive care unit demanded complete focus and emotional presence, requiring me to compartmentalize personal concerns in order to provide the level of care my patients deserved. These 12-hour shifts became periods of forced normalcy, where Michael's problems couldn't intrude on life-and-death medical decisions. During one particularly challenging shift in late May, I found myself caring for a young woman who'd been brought in after a severe car accident, her injuries requiring constant monitoring and complex medication management. Her brother sat vigil beside her bed, holding her hand and speaking softly about memories from their childhood, promising that everything would be okay when she woke up. Watching this family's crisis unfold reminded me powerfully of the bond Michael and I had once shared, the unquestioning loyalty and protection that had defined our relationship throughout childhood and adolescence. The contrast between this brother's devotion and Michael's current absence from my life felt like a physical ache that I carried throughout that shift and many others that followed. The patient eventually recovered, and her brother's tears of relief when she opened her eyes and recognized him created one of those moments of pure joy that made nursing feel like the most meaningful profession in the world. But as I watched their reunion, I couldn't help wondering if Michael and I would ever experience that kind of healing, or if the damage to our relationship had progressed beyond repair. June brought the first concrete information about Michael's whereabouts in over 2 months. Mom called me at work with news that sent chills down my spine despite the desert heat that was already reaching dangerous levels outside the hospital walls. A neighbor of theirs had spotted Michael at a convenience store near downtown Phoenix, his appearance so dramatically altered that she'd almost not recognized him. She said he looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks, Mom reported, her voice tight with worry and barely controlled panic. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he seemed to be arguing with someone on the phone outside the store. When she approached him to say hello, he looked right through her like she was a stranger, then walked away without acknowledgement. This sighting confirmed our worst fears, while simultaneously providing relief that he was still alive and apparently still in the area. But the description of his condition painted a picture of deterioration that had progressed far beyond anything we'd imagined during his months of silence. The Michael who'd been evicted from his apartment had apparently continued spiraling downward at an accelerated pace. Daniel and I spent that evening driving through areas of Phoenix where homeless populations congregated, searching faces in tent encampments and shelters for any sign of my brother. The experience of looking for Michael among people who'd lost everything to addiction, mental illness, or economic catastrophe felt surreal and heartbreaking in ways I hadn't anticipated. We didn't find him that night or during several similar expeditions over the following weeks, but the search process forced me to confront the reality of how far someone could fall when addiction took complete control of their life. Many of the people we encountered were clearly intelligent, articulate individuals who'd once had families, careers, and normal lives before substances stripped away everything that had once defined their identity. The summer heat in Phoenix became particularly brutal that year, with temperatures reaching dangerous levels that created genuine health risks for anyone without adequate shelter or air conditioning. Local news reports regularly covered heat-related hospitalizations and deaths, reminding us daily that Michael's situation had become literally life-threatening if he was indeed living on the streets. My shifts at the hospital brought increasing numbers of heat exhaustion cases, many involving homeless individuals who'd been found unconscious in areas without shade or water. Each ambulance arrival created moments of terror, as I wondered if this would be the patient who turned out to be my brother, brought in too late for medical intervention to save his life. During one particularly busy emergency response, paramedics brought in an unconscious male in his 30s, his identification lost, and his condition critical from prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures. For the 15 minutes it took to stabilize him and confirm his identity, I operated in a state of controlled panic, maintaining professional competence while privately fearing I was treating Michael without recognizing him. The patient turned out to be someone else's brother, someone else's family tragedy, but the experience left me shaken in ways that affected my work performance for days afterward. My supervisor, Patricia Wells, noticed my distraction and called me into her office for a conversation that would prove more helpful than I'd expected. "Jessica," she said with the kind of directness that effective administrators develop through years of managing healthcare professionals, "you're one of our most reliable nurses, but something's been affecting your focus lately. Is there anything going on that we should know about? Anything we can help you manage?" The question opened floodgates I'd been trying to keep sealed throughout months of family crisis. The entire story of Michael's addiction, disappearance, and my constant worry about his welfare came pouring out in a rush of words that felt both relieving and embarrassing. Patricia listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that helped me organize my scattered thoughts and emotions. "Family addiction is more common than you might think among healthcare workers," she told me when I'd finished my account. "We see the medical consequences of substance abuse every day, which makes it especially difficult when someone we love is struggling with the same issues. Have you considered counseling, either for yourself or as part of a family intervention approach?" Her suggestion opened possibilities I hadn't considered, resources that could provide professional guidance for navigating Michael's addiction and its impact on our entire family. Patricia connected me with the hospital's Employee Assistance Program, which offered both individual counseling and specialized support for families dealing with addiction issues. The counselor I began seeing weekly, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, helped me understand the difference between supporting someone through recovery and enabling their continued self-destruction. Our sessions focused on establishing healthy boundaries, recognizing manipulation tactics, and managing the guilt that came with refusing to provide money or other assistance that might contribute to addictive behaviors. "Addiction changes the brain in ways that make the person you love seem like a stranger," Dr. Mitchell explained during one of our early sessions. "The brother you remember is still there somewhere, but the addiction has become the dominant force controlling his decisions and behaviors. Until he chooses recovery, your attempts to help him will likely be redirected toward feeding the addiction rather than promoting healing." These insights provided intellectual framework for understanding Michael's transformation, but they couldn't eliminate the emotional pain of watching someone I'd loved and trusted become capable of manipulation, abandonment, and increasingly dangerous choices. The grieving process for someone who was still alive but fundamentally changed proved more complex than mourning someone who died. July brought another sighting, this time from Dad, who'd spotted Michael near a downtown bus station engaged in what appeared to be a drug transaction, with several individuals whose appearance and behavior clearly indicated their involvement in Phoenix's thriving illegal substances trade. Dad had considered approaching Michael but decided against it when he observed the aggressive body language of the people surrounding him. "I didn't recognize the person I saw," Dad told me during a phone call that evening, his voice heavy with grief and disappointment. The way he moved, the way he interacted with those people, everything about him seemed foreign. It was like watching a stranger who happened to have Michael's face. This sighting provided more definitive confirmation that Michael's problems had progressed from prescription pills or recreational substances to serious involvement with street drugs and the dangerous culture that surrounded them. The implications for his safety and the likelihood of voluntary recovery became significantly more alarming with this information. Daniel and I began having difficult conversations about the realistic limits of what we could or should do to help Michael, if and when he eventually contacted us again. The counseling sessions had provided clear guidance about avoiding enabling behaviors, but translating that knowledge into specific responses when faced with Michael's desperate pleas would require emotional strength I wasn't sure I possessed. August arrived with temperatures that made outdoor activities dangerous during daylight hours and created genuine concern for anyone without adequate shelter. The local news regularly reported heat-related deaths, and homeless advocacy organizations issued warnings about the critical need for hydration and shade during the peak summer months in the Sonoran Desert. My work schedule shifted to include more weekend and evening hours, partly due to hospital staffing needs, but also because staying busy provided distraction from constant worry about Michael's condition. The intensive care unit remained demanding and rewarding, but even successful patient outcomes couldn't completely banish the underlying anxiety about my brother's welfare. During one particularly quiet night shift in late August, while monitoring stable patients who required minimal intervention, I found myself thinking about all the moments throughout our childhood when Michael had been there for me during difficult times. The brother who'd taught me to ride my bike, who'd defended me against school bullies, who'd celebrated my achievements with genuine pride, that person seemed to have been replaced by someone I no longer recognized or trusted. The grief for this lost relationship felt overwhelming during those quiet hospital hours, when professional responsibilities didn't require complete focus. I grieved not just for Michael's current situation, but for the future we'd always assumed we'd share. Holidays and family gatherings where our children would play together. Milestone birthdays where we'd reminisce about growing up in the desert. Retirement years when we'd take care of aging parents as a team. September brought the first direct contact from Michael in over 4 months, a phone call that came at 2 a.m. while I was working a night shift at the hospital. His voice sounded so weak and distorted that I initially didn't recognize it as belonging to my brother, and when I did, the shock of hearing from him after such prolonged silence left me momentarily speechless. "Jessica," he whispered into the phone, his words slurred and barely intelligible. "I need help. Real help this time. I'm in trouble, bad trouble, and I don't know what to do." The desperation in his voice was more complete than anything I'd heard during his previous crisis calls, suggesting that whatever situation he'd gotten himself into had progressed beyond his ability to manage or control. But the timing of his call, reaching out when I was at work and couldn't immediately respond to his crisis, felt calculated in ways that reminded me of Dr. Mitchell's warnings about manipulation tactics. "Michael, where are you? Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" I asked, trying to maintain professional calm while managing the emotional storm his call had created. His responses were vague and contradictory, mentioning various locations around Phoenix without providing specific information that would allow me to find him or send appropriate help. When I pressed for details about the nature of his trouble, he became agitated and defensive, insisting that I either trusted him completely or not at all. "I can't explain everything over the phone," he said, his voice taking on that familiar edge of manipulative urgency. "Just bring $3,000 to the parking lot behind the Circle K on 7th Street. Come alone, and come right now, or it might be too late. The amount he requested was significantly larger than any previous demand, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his need for such a substantial sum triggered every warning bell that months of counseling had helped me develop. Dr. Mitchell's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that addiction progressively requires larger amounts of money to satisfy, and that crisis situations often escalate when previous sources of funds become unavailable. Michael, I can't leave work in the middle of my shift, and I'm not comfortable bringing that amount of cash to meet you somewhere without understanding what's happening, I told him, trying to maintain firm boundaries while leaving room for genuine assistance if he was truly in danger. His response revealed the extent to which addiction had corrupted his ability to consider anyone's needs or circumstances beyond his immediate desperation for drugs and money. He accused me of caring more about my job than his life, of being selfish and uncaring, of abandoning family when it mattered most. The emotional manipulation was so transparent that I recognized it even while feeling its intended effect. "If something happens to me tonight because you wouldn't help," he said before ending the call, "remember that you chose your precious career over your own brother's life." The line went silent, leaving me standing in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m, shaking with adrenaline and conflicting emotions that made it difficult to return to my patient care responsibilities. The professional part of my mind recognized Michael's call as a classic manipulation attempt, but the sister who'd loved him for 29 years couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that he was genuinely in danger. I called Daniel, waking him from sleep to share the details of Michael's latest crisis and request for money. His response reflected months of our own processing and counseling about appropriate boundaries and responses to addiction-related manipulation. "You did the right thing," he assured me. "If Michael is genuinely in physical danger, he should be calling police, not asking his sister to bring cash to a parking lot in the middle of the night. This has all the hallmarks of a setup designed to get money for drugs." His words provided rational perspective that my emotional connection to Michael made difficult to maintain independently. But even with Daniel's support and months of counseling preparation, saying no to Michael's desperate plea felt like abandonment, regardless of how clearly I could see the manipulation tactics he was employing. The next morning brought calls from both Mom and Dad, who'd apparently received similar middle-of-the-night contact from Michael, with slightly different versions of his crisis story. Comparing our accounts revealed inconsistencies that confirmed the manipulative nature of his outreach, but they also provided disturbing insights into how completely addiction had compromised his relationship with truth and family bonds. Mom had been told that people were threatening him over unpaid debts and that he needed $2,000 immediately to buy safe passage out of Phoenix. Dad's version involved stolen property that needed to be returned before police involvement became unavoidable, requiring $2,500 for restitution. The varying amounts and explanations demonstrated how desperately Michael was trying to extract money from multiple family sources simultaneously. "We all said no," Dad reported during our family conference call that morning. "It killed me to hang up on him when he sounded so scared. But none of his stories made sense, and we all remembered what you'd told us about enabling versus helping." The coordinated response felt like progress in our family's ability to recognize and resist manipulation, but it also meant that Michael's primary sources of financial support had been simultaneously eliminated. Dr. Mitchell had warned that cutting off funds often led to escalated behaviors, as addictions sought new ways to obtain necessary resources for continued substance use. October arrived with cooler temperatures that made outdoor survival more manageable, but also with growing concern about what lengths Michael might pursue to obtain money now that family sources had become unavailable. News reports about increased property crimes, break-ins, and drug-related violence served as constant reminders of the dangerous world Michael had apparently entered. My work at the hospital continued providing structure and purpose, but treating patients with addiction-related medical problems created ongoing emotional challenges that required careful management with Dr. Mitchell's support. Each overdose case, each injury resulting from drug-related violence, each family crying in waiting rooms, served as reminders of the potential consequences awaiting Michael if his situation continued deteriorating. The calls stopped completely after our family's unified refusal to provide money, creating another period of silence that felt even more ominous than before. This time, the quiet carried implications of Michael potentially pursuing more dangerous means of funding his addiction, methods that might not involve family contact until crisis situations required emergency medical intervention. Daniel and I established routines designed to maintain our own mental health and relationship stability while remaining prepared to respond appropriately if genuine emergency arose. We continued counseling, both individually and together, developing strategies for managing the chronic stress of loving someone whose addiction had made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous. November brought our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, a holiday that should have been joyful but felt incomplete with Michael's absence from family traditions that had always included both of us. Mom and Dad joined Daniel and me for dinner at our townhouse, and while we maintained festive atmosphere and gratitude for our blessings, Michael's empty chair served as a constant reminder of how addiction had fractured our family structure. During our evening cleanup, Mom mentioned that she'd been driving through areas where homeless populations gathered, searching for Michael, among faces that had become increasingly difficult to distinguish from one another. Her descriptions of people she'd encountered during these searches painted disturbing pictures of how quickly addiction could strip away every external marker of the person someone had once been. "I keep thinking I'll recognize him," she said while drying dishes with mechanical precision that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed many times in her mind. "But the truth is, if he's changed as much as we think he has, I might walk right past him without knowing it was my own son." December passed quietly, with holiday preparations that felt hollow without Michael's participation or even knowledge of his whereabouts. The gifts Mom had purchased for him remained wrapped under her tree, symbols of hope that he might somehow appear for Christmas morning, as he had throughout our childhood. Christmas Day arrived with perfect weather and family gatherings that maintained surface normalcy, while everyone privately wondered about Michael's condition and location. The desert landscape looked particularly beautiful that morning, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that reminded me of countless family adventures from happier times, when our biggest concerns involved which hiking trail to explore, or what time to start the barbecue. But as evening approached and our small celebration wound down, I found myself staring at the mountain silhouettes against the sunset sky, wondering if Michael was somewhere out there watching the same view, remembering the same family traditions, feeling the same sense of loss and disconnection that had settled over all of us, like desert dust that never quite washed away. The silence continued through New Year's and into January, creating an atmosphere of waiting that felt increasingly unsustainable. Something was building toward a confrontation none of us could anticipate. A collision between Michael's desperation and our family's new boundaries that would test every lesson we'd learned about loving someone through addiction while protecting ourselves from its destructive power. That confrontation would come sooner than expected, and in ways more violent and shocking than any of us had imagined possible. February 15th arrived like any other Tuesday in Phoenix, with clear skies and temperatures climbing toward another pleasant desert day. I'd worked a particularly challenging night shift at Banner Desert, dealing with 3 cardiac emergencies and a multi-vehicle accident that kept our entire ICU team operating at maximum capacity until dawn. The exhaustion that followed such intense medical situations created a bone-deep weariness that usually meant immediate sleep upon arriving home. Daniel had already left for school by the time I pulled into our driveway, his coffee mug still warm in the sink, and a sweet note on the kitchen counter wishing me restful sleep and promising dinner at our favorite Thai restaurant when I woke up. These small gestures of love and consideration had become even more precious during the months of stress surrounding Michael's situation. Reminders that healthy relationships involved mutual support, rather than constant crisis management. I changed into comfortable pajamas and settled into our bedroom, blackout curtains drawn against the brightening morning sun. Sleep came quickly despite the underlying anxiety that had become my constant companion since Michael's disappearance from regular contact. Even in unconsciousness, my mind remained partially alert for phone calls that might bring news about his condition or whereabouts. The sound that woke me 3 hours later wasn't the telephone I'd been subconsciously expecting, but rather the unmistakable noise of someone moving around in our garage. The mechanical clicking and scraping sounds suggested someone was handling tools or attempting to manipulate the automatic door opener, creating disturbances that filtered through our shared wall into the bedroom where I lay, trying to determine if the sounds were real or part of some stress-induced dream. Daniel's car was at school and mine was parked in the driveway, leaving our garage empty except for storage boxes, lawn equipment, and Daniel's workbench where he pursued woodworking projects during weekend hours. No legitimate reason existed for anyone to be accessing that space during weekday morning hours, when both residents were supposed to be absent from the property. I slipped from bed quietly, bare feet silent on the cool tile floor as I moved toward the kitchen window that offered a view of our garage area. The angle didn't allow direct observation of the interior space, but shadows moving across the concrete floor confirmed that someone was definitely inside, moving with familiar ease that suggested knowledge of the layout and contents. My nursing training included emergency response protocols that emphasized personal safety assessment before attempting to help others in crisis situations. The rational response would have been to call police immediately and wait for professional law enforcement to investigate the unauthorized entry, but something about the movement patterns visible through the window triggered recognition that overrode cautious instincts. The way the shadow moved, the particular rhythm of footsteps, the careful handling of objects being shifted around the space, all these details created an almost certain conviction that Michael was in our garage, searching for items he could remove and sell to fund his continued drug use. The realization filled me with complex emotions that included relief at knowing he was alive, anger at his violation of our home, and fear about what condition he might be in after months of street living. I approached the connecting door between our kitchen and garage with trembling hands, unsure whether to announce my presence or attempt to observe his condition before revealing that I was home. The decision was made for me when the door handle turned under my touch, apparently left unlocked during his entry, opening to reveal a scene that shocked me despite months of mental preparation for Michael's deterioration. The person crouched beside Daniel's workbench bore almost no resemblance to the brother I'd grown up loving and admiring. Months of living rough had stripped away probably 40 pounds from his already lean frame, leaving him skeletal and gaunt in ways that spoke of serious malnutrition and probable medical complications. His clothes were filthy layers of mismatched items that appeared to have been acquired from donation sources or found abandoned, hanging on his diminished frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. But the most shocking change was in his eyes, which had lost all traces of the warmth, intelligence, and mischievous humor that had defined Michael's personality throughout our shared childhood and adolescence. These eyes were hollow, desperate, constantly moving with the paranoid alertness of someone who expected threats to emerge from any direction at any moment. They were the eyes of a stranger wearing my brother's face. "Michael," I said softly, not wanting to startle him but needing to announce my presence before he became aware of being observed. "What are you doing here?" He spun toward my voice with jerky, uncontrolled movements that suggested his nervous system was operating under the influence of powerful stimulants. When his gaze focused on my face, the recognition that dawned there was accompanied by emotions I couldn't immediately identify, relief mixed with resentment, desperation combined with defensive anger. "Jessica," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper that had to be forced through what appeared to be a chronically dry throat. "I didn't think you'd be home. I just needed to borrow a few things, stuff Daniel won't even notice is missing. Just temporary, until I get back on my feet." The casual way he discussed stealing from our home while standing among Daniel's carefully organized tools and our stored personal belongings revealed how completely addiction had corrupted his moral framework. The brother who'd once returned found money to store clerks was now justifying theft from family members as reasonable behavior under circumstances he'd created through his own choices. "Michael, you can't take things from our house. This is breaking and entering, and you're talking about stealing from people who love you." I kept my voice calm and non-accusatory, drawing on techniques Dr. Mitchell had taught me for de-escalating confrontations with people under the influence of mind-altering substances. His response demonstrated how addiction had rewired his thought processes to interpret any resistance to his demands as personal attacks deserving of aggressive retaliation. "Love me?" he repeated, his voice rising with indignation that seemed genuinely felt despite its basis in distorted thinking. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have abandoned me when I needed help the most. You wouldn't have turned your back on family because you were too selfish to share your money. The accusation stung because it targeted the guilt I'd been carrying despite months of counseling, designed to help me understand the difference between loving support and destructive enabling. Michael's ability to identify and exploit my emotional vulnerabilities hadn't been diminished by addiction. If anything, desperation had sharpened his manipulation skills to razor-sharp effectiveness. "I haven't abandoned you," I replied, trying to maintain the calm tone while fighting rising anger at his characterization of my boundaries as abandonment. "I've refused to give you money that would be used for drugs, but I've never stopped loving you or hoping you'd choose recovery." This distinction between loving him and refusing to fund his addiction was one Dr. Mitchell had emphasized repeatedly during our sessions. But Michael's reaction made it clear that addiction had eliminated his ability to perceive such nuances. From his perspective, any refusal to meet his demands for financial assistance represented total rejection and betrayal of family bonds. "Recovery?" He laughed, a harsh sound that contained no humor and revealed teeth that had deteriorated significantly during his months of drug use and poor nutrition. "Recovery? From what? From being abandoned by my own family when life got difficult? From watching my sister choose her perfect little marriage over helping her own brother survive?" His interpretation of recent events bore no relationship to actual circumstances, but arguing with someone whose perception had been altered by prolonged substance abuse would accomplish nothing except escalation of the confrontation. I focused instead on practical immediate concerns, primarily getting him out of our garage and hopefully connected with professional help. "Michael, I want to help you, but not like this. Put down Daniel's tools and let's sit down somewhere to talk about real solutions. There are treatment programs, detox facilities, counselors who specialize in addiction recovery. I'll drive you anywhere you want to go right now if you're ready to get clean." The offer was genuine, made despite Dr. Mitchell's warnings about the low success rates for treatment attempted under family pressure rather than personal motivation. Even knowing that forced rehabilitation rarely succeeded, I couldn't resist making the attempt when confronted with visible evidence of how desperately Michael needed professional intervention. His response revealed the depth of his denial about the severity of his condition and the extent to which paranoid thinking had become his default mental state. "I don't need treatment," he snarled, clutching a cordless drill to his chest like a security blanket. "I need money to get out of the hole I'm in, to pay off the people who are looking for me, to get back to normal life. But my own family would rather see me dead than help me solve my problems." The mention of people looking for him suggested involvement with drug dealers or other criminal elements who might pose genuine threats to his safety. But his refusal to provide specific details made it impossible to assess whether the danger was real or addiction-induced paranoia. Either way, his presence in our home was creating risk for Daniel and me that couldn't be ignored or minimized. "If you're in danger, we should call the police," I suggested, knowing he'd reject the idea, but hoping to gauge his reaction for clues about the actual nature of his situation. "Police?" His voice cracked with what might have been genuine terror or calculated manipulation designed to evoke my sympathy. "The police are the last people I can trust right now. Jessica, you have no idea what kind of trouble I'm in, the kind of people who want to hurt me. I need cash, a lot of cash, and I need it today, or something really bad is going to happen to me." This return to financial demands, couched in vague threats about unnamed dangers, followed the exact pattern Dr. Mitchell had described as typical manipulation by people whose addiction had progressed to complete desperation. The crisis was always immediate, the consequences always catastrophic, the solution always requiring money that would inevitably be used to purchase drugs rather than resolve any legitimate emergency. "Michael, I can't give you money, but I can help you in other ways. Let me call a treatment center, or a crisis counselor, or even just drive you somewhere safe where we can figure out next steps together." My voice was beginning to show strain as the confrontation continued without any movement toward resolution. What happened next unfolded so quickly that my memory of it later felt fragmented and surreal, like watching a violent movie scene, rather than experiencing actual events. Michael's face contorted with rage that seemed to emerge from some deep place where months of frustration, disappointment, and addiction-fueled paranoia had been building pressure like water behind a cracked dam. "You're just like all the rest of them," he screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of our garage with intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward. Selfish, judgmental, pretending to care while you watch me suffer. You think you're better than me because you have your perfect job and perfect marriage and perfect little life, but you're nothing but a hypocrite who abandoned her own brother when he needed her most. The verbal assault was devastating not because of its volume or viciousness, but because it contained just enough distorted truth to trigger all the guilt and self-doubt I'd been working to overcome through months of counseling. The part of me that had always felt responsible for solving other people's problems responded to his accusations with familiar shame, even though my rational mind recognized them as manipulation tactics. "Michael, please calm down," I said, raising my hands in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture while backing toward the door that led back into our house. "We can work through this together, but not while you're this upset. Let's both take some deep breaths and try to find a solution that actually helps your situation." My attempt at de-escalation seemed to trigger even greater fury, as though my calm tone was somehow insulting or condescending to his emotional state. He began pacing in the confined space of our garage, clutching Daniel's drill while muttering phrases I couldn't quite understand, his movements becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. "Don't talk to me like I'm one of your mental patients," he snarled, apparently interpreting my professional demeanor as evidence that I considered him crazy rather than sick. "I'm not some homeless junkie you can diagnose and dismiss. I'm your brother, and I'm asking for help from my own family, and you're treating me like garbage." The irony of his rejection of the homeless junkie label while exhibiting all the visible signs of extended homelessness and serious drug addiction would have been laughable under different circumstances. But the combination of his deteriorated physical condition, obvious intoxication, and escalating emotional volatility was creating a genuinely dangerous situation that required careful management. "You're right, you're my brother, and I love you," I said, hoping that acknowledging our relationship might help him regain some emotional control. "But love doesn't mean giving you money for drugs. Love means wanting you to get healthy and have a real life again, not enabling behaviors that are destroying you." This distinction between love and enabling, which had become central to my understanding of appropriate responses to Michael's addiction, apparently represented the ultimate betrayal from his perspective. His face went through a series of expressions that culminated in cold hatred more frightening than his previous anger. "Enabling?" he repeated, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. "You think helping your own brother survive is enabling? You think watching me lose everything while you live in your comfortable house with your comfortable husband is love?" The space between us seemed to contract as he moved closer, still clutching the power drill while his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made every instinct in my body scream warnings about immediate physical danger. But this was still Michael, still my brother despite everything addiction had done to alter his personality and judgment, and I couldn't quite believe he would actually hurt me. "Michael, you need to leave now," I said, trying to inject authority into my voice while fighting the fear that was making my hands shake and my heart race. "Take whatever you came for and go, but don't come back here again unless you're ready to get help with your addiction." The ultimatum was meant to give him a face-saving way to exit the confrontation, while establishing clear boundaries about future contact. But it had the opposite effect of crystallizing his rage into focused determination, to force me to comply with his demands through whatever means necessary. "I'm not leaving without money," he said, his voice now completely steady in ways that felt more threatening than his previous emotional volatility. "And you're not going to stand there in your designer pajamas telling me what I can and can't do in my own family. You're going to go inside, get your purse, and give me enough cash to solve my problems. Or you're going to regret treating me like garbage." The threat was unmistakable, and my nursing experience with violent patients helped me recognize the signs that indicated he was moving from verbal aggression toward potential physical action. His stance had shifted into something more balanced and aggressive, his grip on the drill had tightened, and his eyes had acquired the cold focus that often preceded violent behavior in people under the influence of stimulants. "Michael, I'm going to go inside now," I said, speaking slowly and clearly while continuing to back toward the door. "If you want to take some tools or other things, go ahead, but don't follow me into the house." I turned toward the door, hoping that removing myself from his immediate presence would allow him to take whatever items he'd originally planned to steal and leave without further confrontation. The plan was reasonable and might have worked with someone whose judgment hadn't been completely compromised by months of heavy drug use and mounting desperation. Instead, Michael interpreted my attempt to leave as final confirmation that I was abandoning him in his moment of greatest need, triggering an explosion of rage that transformed him from manipulative family member into genuinely dangerous predator. The sound of his footsteps charging across the concrete floor gave me just enough warning to begin turning back toward him before his shoulder slammed into my chest with the force of a linebacker making a tackle. The impact drove all the air from my lungs while launching me backward into the concrete wall of our garage, with sufficient force to create a sickening crack that might have been the wall or might have been something inside my body. Pain exploded through my ribcage and spine as I slid down the wall onto the oil-stained floor, gasping for breath that wouldn't come and trying to process what had just happened. Michael stood over me, the power drill still in his hand, his face showing a mixture of shock and satisfaction that suggested he was simultaneously surprised by his own actions and pleased with their effectiveness. The transformation was complete now. Nothing remained of the protective big brother who'd taught me to ride a bike and shown me constellations in the desert sky. "Now you're going to listen to me," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the violence he'd just committed against his own sister. "You're going to get me $5,000 right now, or I'm going to make sure you understand what real problems feel like." Each word he spoke sent new spikes of pain through my damaged ribs, making it difficult to focus on his threats or formulate any kind of response. The garage walls seemed to be spinning slightly, and I was beginning to suspect that the impact had caused injuries more serious than bruises and minor fractures. "I can't," I managed to wheeze through the pain. "Don't have that much cash available." His response demonstrated how completely addiction had severed his connection to reality and normal human empathy. Instead of showing concern for the sister he'd just physically assaulted, he became more agitated by my inability to immediately meet his financial demands. "Then we'll go to the bank together," he said, reaching down to grab my arm with hands that shook from drug withdrawal or stimulant overuse. "You're going to withdraw whatever you can, and then we're going to figure out how to get the rest. Credit cards, loans, whatever it takes." The plan he was outlining amounted to kidnapping and forced theft, crimes that would destroy both our lives while providing him with temporary funding for continued drug use. But pointing out these logical flaws would be pointless when dealing with someone whose decision-making ability had been completely compromised by chemical dependency. "Michael, I need medical attention," I said, hoping that my obvious injuries might trigger some remnant of the caring person he'd once been. "Something's wrong with my ribs, and I'm having trouble breathing properly." His response revealed the complete absence of empathy that advanced addiction often created, replacing normal human emotion with single-minded focus on obtaining drugs, regardless of consequences to self or others. "You'll be fine once I get what I need," he said dismissively. "Stop being dramatic and get up so we can go to the bank." The attempt to stand sent new waves of pain through my torso, accompanied by a grinding sensation in my chest that suggested at least one rib had been fractured or displaced by the impact with the concrete wall. Each breath required conscious effort and created sharp pains that radiated from my back around to my sternum. "I can't drive like this," I said, leaning against the wall for support while trying to assess the full extent of my injuries. "I need to go to the hospital first, then we can talk about other things." The mention of a hospital triggered immediate paranoia in Michael's drug-altered thinking, apparently suggesting to him that medical personnel would ask questions about my injuries that might lead to his arrest for assault. His response demonstrated how addiction had trained him to view every situation primarily in terms of potential threats to his continued access to substances. "No hospitals," he said firmly, moving closer in ways that felt increasingly threatening. "No doctors, no questions, no police reports. You're going to get in your car, drive to the bank, and withdraw money. Everything else can wait until I'm safely out of town." The demand was unreasonable on multiple levels, but arguing with someone in Michael's condition would likely escalate the violence rather than resolve the situation peacefully. My nursing training included protocols for managing combative patients, but those techniques assumed the availability of security personnel and medical equipment that weren't present in our garage. "Okay," I said, hoping that apparent cooperation might buy time to develop a better plan or attract attention from neighbors who might notice unusual activity. "Let me get my purse and car keys from inside the house." Michael's paranoid suspicion made him reject any suggestion that involved me leaving his immediate supervision, apparently concerned that I would call for help or escape through other exits from our home. "We'll get your purse together," he said, positioning himself between me and the door. "I'm not letting you out of my sight until this is finished." The walk from our garage into the kitchen felt like traversing a great distance, with each step sending new jolts of pain through my damaged ribs and making breathing increasingly difficult. Michael stayed close behind me, the power drill still in his hand, serving as an implicit threat against any attempt to deviate from his plan. Inside our kitchen, the normal domestic details of Daniel's coffee mug and breakfast dishes created surreal contrast with the violence that had just occurred in our garage. This was supposed to be our safe space, the refuge where we'd built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection, now violated by addiction's capacity to corrupt everything it touched. My purse was on the counter where I'd left it after arriving home from my hospital shift, but reaching for it required stretching movements that sent new spikes of pain through my injured torso. Michael watched my every motion with the hyper-vigilant attention of someone whose drug use had created persistent paranoid thinking. "How much cash do you have in there?" he demanded, apparently expecting me to carry large amounts of money for reasons that made sense only to someone whose life revolved around drug transactions. "Maybe $60, I replied honestly, knowing that normal people didn't typically carry thousands in cash, but hoping the small amount might satisfy him enough to end the confrontation. His reaction to this news demonstrated how completely his expectations had been distorted by months of living in environments where large cash amounts were routine parts of illegal transactions. "$60? He repeated incredulously. "What kind of financial advisor doesn't carry serious money?" The correction that I was a nurse rather than financial advisor seemed pointless given his level of agitation, and the error suggested that his memory and cognitive function had been significantly impaired by prolonged substance abuse. These mental changes made him even more unpredictable and potentially dangerous. "We'll have to go to the ATM, he concluded, apparently still believing that bank machines would dispense thousands of dollars to anyone with a valid card. "How much can you withdraw at once?" "Usually there's a daily limit of around $300, I explained, hoping that learning about these practical limitations might help him understand that his plan was unrealistic from the beginning. This information seemed to enrage him further, as though banking regulations were personal insults designed specifically to interfere with his drug-fueled schemes. "$300? He shouted, raising the drill in ways that suggested he was considering using it as a weapon. "I need real money, not pocket change. You're gonna figure out how to get more, or we're gonna have serious problems." The threat was accompanied by movements toward me that triggered every survival instinct my body possessed, flooding my system with adrenaline that temporarily overrode the pain from my injured ribs. Without conscious decision, I found myself grabbing the largest knife from our kitchen block, holding it between us while backing toward the phone mounted on our wall. "Michael, stop," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "I'm calling for help right now. You need to leave immediately, or this is going to get much worse for both of us." The sight of his sister holding a knife apparently triggered some remnant of shock in his drug-altered consciousness, creating a moment of hesitation that might have allowed peaceful resolution if addiction hadn't already pushed him beyond the point where rational thinking was possible. Instead of recognizing the serious escalation his behavior had created, Michael interpreted my defensive action as further evidence of my betrayal and abandonment. "You're threatening me now?" he said, his voice filled with hurt that might have been genuine despite the circumstances. "Your own brother is asking for help, and you're pointing a knife at me?" "You assaulted me in my own home," I replied, trying to keep the knife steady despite hands that were shaking from pain, fear, and adrenaline. "You've threatened me multiple times, and now you're trying to force me to help you commit crimes." This has gone way beyond asking for help. The distinction between legitimate requests for assistance and criminal coercion was another concept that addiction had apparently eliminated from his cognitive repertoire. From his perspective, any resistance to his demands represented unreasonable selfishness that justified whatever measures became necessary to overcome that resistance. "Put the knife down, Jessica," he said, his voice taking on a cold tone that sent chills down my already injured spine. "You're not going to hurt me, and we both know it." You're too much of a good person to actually use that thing, which means you're just making this harder than it needs to be. His assessment of my character was probably accurate under normal circumstances, but people defending themselves from violence often discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. The combination of physical pain, emotional betrayal, and genuine fear for my safety had activated protective instincts that might have surprised both of us. "I will use it if you come any closer," I said, meaning every word despite hoping desperately that the threat alone would be sufficient to end the confrontation. "And I'm calling 911 right now, whether you like it or not." I reached for the phone with my free hand, keeping the knife pointed toward Michael while trying to dial emergency services. The movement required taking my eyes off him for just a moment, long enough for him to lunge forward and grab my wrist with the hand holding the weapon. What followed was a brief but violent struggle, during which months of frustration, betrayal, and desperation erupted into physical combat between siblings who'd once shared bedroom stories and desert adventures. The knife clattered to the floor as we grappled for control, his drug-enhanced strength eventually overcoming my injured condition and hospital shift exhaustion. When the fight ended, I was on the kitchen floor with Michael standing over me, breathing heavily while blood dripped from scratches on his arms where my defensive efforts had connected. The power drill lay beside him where he'd dropped it during our struggle, but his hands were now empty and shaking from the physical exertion and chemical withdrawal. "Look what you made me do," he said, his voice containing a mixture of accusation and genuine regret that suggested some part of him recognized how completely wrong the situation had become. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jessica, but you wouldn't listen to reason. You forced me to get physical because you wouldn't help me when I needed it most." The blame shifting was textbook addiction behavior, but hearing it applied to his assault on me created new levels of anger that temporarily overrode pain and fear. "I didn't make you do anything," I said through gritted teeth. "You chose to break into our house, you chose to attack me, and you chose to threaten me with weapons. Those were your decisions, not mine." This assignment of responsibility for his actions seemed to trigger fresh rage, as though addiction had made him incapable of accepting accountability for any consequences of his behavior. "My decisions?" he repeated incredulously. "I'm dying out there, sleeping in alleys, dodging people who want to kill me, eating garbage from dumpsters, and my own sister won't lift a finger to help. What choice did I have except to take matters into my own hands?" The self-pity in his voice might have evoked sympathy under different circumstances, but hearing it while lying injured on my kitchen floor eliminated any remaining traces of guilt about refusing his demands for money. This was exactly the kind of manipulation Mitchell had warned me about, designed to make me feel responsible for consequences he'd created through his own choices. "You had the choice to get help," I replied, struggling to sit up despite the grinding pain in my ribs. "Treatment programs, detox facilities, counseling services, all available if you'd been willing to admit you had a problem. Instead, you chose drugs, and now you're choosing violence to get money for more drugs." The accuracy of this assessment apparently struck too close to truths he wasn't ready to acknowledge, triggering another explosion of defensive anger. "Treatment?" he screamed, his voice echoing off our kitchen walls. "Treatment from people who don't know me, don't care about me, just want to lock me up and pump me full of different drugs? The only treatment I need is getting enough money to stabilize my situation and get back to normal life." This fantasy that adequate funding would somehow restore him to his previous condition revealed how completely addiction had distorted his understanding of cause and effect. The drugs weren't a response to financial problems. The financial problems were a consequence of drug use that had progressed far beyond any amount of money's ability to resolve. But explaining this logical sequence would be pointless when dealing with someone whose cognitive abilities had been severely compromised by prolonged substance abuse. Instead, I focused on immediate practical concerns, primarily getting through this confrontation without sustaining injuries that might prove permanently disabling. "Michael, I need medical attention for my ribs," I said, trying to redirect his attention toward my obvious physical distress. "If you want money from me, I have to be healthy enough to go to the bank and make withdrawals. Right now I can barely breathe properly." This practical consideration seemed to penetrate his drug-altered thinking in ways that emotional appeals had failed to achieve. He looked at me more carefully, apparently noticing for the first time the labored breathing and protective posturing that indicated serious internal injuries. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice containing the first hint of genuine concern I'd heard since discovering him in our garage. "Bad enough that I might have punctured a lung or internal bleeding," I replied, exaggerating slightly in hopes that medical urgency might motivate him to allow me to seek professional help. "This isn't something that's going to get better on its own." The mention of potentially life-threatening complications seemed to trigger some remnant of the protective instincts that had once defined Michael's relationship with me. For a moment, his face showed traces of the caring big brother who'd bandaged my childhood scrapes and defended me against playground bullies. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "We'll go to the hospital first, but I'm coming with you. And after they fix you up, we're going to figure out the money situation. This isn't over just because you're hurt." The concession represented progress, even though his continued insistence on financial demands demonstrated that addiction still controlled his decision-making process. At least getting to a hospital would provide access to medical care and potentially law enforcement intervention that could end the confrontation safely. "I'll need to drive myself," I said, knowing that Michael's condition made him unsafe behind the wheel while hoping to maintain some control over the situation. "No way," he replied immediately. "I'm driving, and you're sitting right next to me where I can make sure you don't try anything stupid like jumping out at red lights or signaling for help." The plan was deeply flawed from safety perspectives, but arguing with someone in Michael's mental state would likely escalate the situation rather than improve our circumstances. I focused instead on getting to medical professionals who would be trained in managing violent or unstable individuals. The drive to Phoenix General took 15 minutes that felt like hours, with every bump in the road sending new spikes of pain through my damaged ribs, while Michael muttered constantly about his plans for obtaining money once my medical needs had been addressed. His driving was erratic and aggressive, reflecting the chemical influences affecting his coordination and judgment. "Remember," he said as we pulled into the hospital parking lot, "you fell down some stairs at home, that's all." No mention of our conversation about money. No dramatic stories about family problems. Just a simple accident that needs medical attention. The cover story he was demanding would prevent medical personnel from understanding the true nature of my injuries, potentially interfering with proper treatment while protecting him from criminal consequences for assault. But agreeing seemed necessary to get inside the hospital, where trained professionals could assess the situation. "Okay," I said, hoping that medical staff would recognize signs of violence regardless of whatever explanation I provided. The emergency room at Phoenix General was moderately busy for a Tuesday afternoon, with the usual mix of cardiac patients, accident victims, and psychiatric emergencies that defined urban hospital medicine. Michael stayed close beside me during the registration process, his hyper-vigilant attention making it impossible to communicate privately with intake staff. The triage nurse, a woman about my age with kind eyes and competent demeanor, asked routine questions about my symptoms and medical history while making notes that would determine treatment priority. When she inquired about the cause of my injuries, I found myself hesitating despite Michael's coaching about the cover story. "I fell down some stairs," I said finally, the lie feeling heavy on my tongue while Michael nodded approvingly beside me. The nurse's expression suggested she'd heard similar explanations many times before and had learned to recognize when patients weren't providing complete information about their injuries. Her questions became more specific and detailed, focusing on the exact mechanism of injury in ways that would reveal inconsistencies in fabricated stories. "Which direction were you facing when you fell?" she asked. "Did you hit the wall first or the steps? Were you carrying anything that might have affected your balance?" Michael's increasingly agitated body language made it clear that these detailed questions were making him uncomfortable, probably because the answers wouldn't support the simple accident narrative he'd demanded. I tried to provide responses that wouldn't completely contradict medical evidence while avoiding information that would implicate him in criminal activity. "I was going down the stairs and just lost my footing," I said vaguely, hoping the nurse would accept this explanation and move on to medical rather than investigative concerns. Instead, her training in recognizing domestic violence apparently triggered additional questions designed to provide opportunities for victims to reveal the true nature of their injuries. "Are you safe at home?" she asked quietly, her eyes moving between my face and Michael's obvious agitation. "Is there anything else I should know about your situation?" The question created a moment of opportunity that I almost took, the chance to tell the truth about Michael's assault and request appropriate intervention. But the combination of family loyalty, fear of criminal consequences for my brother, and hope that medical treatment would end the crisis led me to maintain the deception. "I'm fine," I replied, immediately recognizing how unconvincing the words sounded given my obvious injuries and distress. "It was just an accident." The nurse made additional notes while her expression indicated continued skepticism about my explanation, but hospital protocols required her to accept patient statements unless clear evidence contradicted them. "We'll get you back for x-rays and examination as soon as possible," she said. "Please let us know if you need anything while you're waiting." Michael and I found seats in the waiting room among other patients and family members, dealing with various medical emergencies. His behavior became increasingly erratic as we sat there, constantly checking his phone, scanning other people in the room with paranoid attention, and muttering under his breath about how long everything was taking. "This is taking forever," he complained after we'd been waiting about 20 minutes. "How long do these people expect us to sit here while you're in pain?" His impatience seemed driven more by anxiety about being in a public place where his behavior might attract unwanted attention than by genuine concern for my medical condition. The hospital environment, with its security cameras and professional staff trained to recognize suspicious activities, was probably making him increasingly uncomfortable. "Emergency rooms prioritize based on severity," I explained, drawing on my own professional experience to help him understand the process. "Chest injuries usually get seen fairly quickly, but there might be trauma cases that take priority." As if summoned by my words, paramedics wheeled in a patient from a serious motor vehicle accident, their urgent communication with emergency staff creating the kind of controlled chaos that characterized major trauma responses. Michael watched this activity with obvious anxiety, apparently concerned that increased staff attention to other patients would further delay my treatment. "Jessica Martinez?" A voice called from the triage area, indicating that my turn for evaluation had finally arrived. Michael immediately stood to accompany me, but the nurse who'd called my name politely but firmly indicated that he should remain in the waiting room during the initial assessment. "We'll let you know when you can come back," she told him, using the professional tone that healthcare workers employed when establishing necessary boundaries with anxious family members. Michael's reaction to being separated from me was immediate and intense. His paranoid thinking apparently interpreting this standard hospital procedure as evidence of some conspiracy designed to interfere with his plans. "She's my sister," he insisted, his voice rising in ways that were beginning to attract attention from other people in the waiting room. "I need to stay with her to make sure she gets proper treatment." The nurse maintained her calm professional demeanor while making it clear that hospital policy would be followed regardless of his preferences. "Sir, I understand your concern, but our examination procedures require privacy for accurate assessment. You're welcome to wait here, and we'll update you on her condition as appropriate." Being separated from Michael felt like escape from immediate danger, even though I knew the separation was only temporary and that he'd be waiting when my examination concluded. The relief was so profound that I nearly broke down crying as the nurse led me through secure doors into the treatment area, where trained medical professionals could properly assess my injuries. The emergency room physician who examined me was Dr. Amanda Foster, a woman in her 40s whose competent manner and thorough approach immediately inspired confidence. She began with standard questions about my symptoms while conducting a preliminary visual assessment that would guide more detailed examination procedures. "Tell me about this fall," she said while gently palpating my ribcage to assess the extent of bone and tissue damage. "What exactly happened and what kind of pain are you experiencing now?" The direct question, asked in a private setting where Michael couldn't monitor my responses, created another opportunity to reveal the true nature of my injuries. But months of protecting him from consequences, combined with genuine fear about what might happen if he was arrested while in his current mental state, led me to maintain the fabricated story. "I lost my footing going downstairs and hit the wall pretty hard," I said, wincing as her examination revealed the full extent of damage to my ribcage. "The pain is mostly on the right side, sharp when I breathe deeply." Dr. Foster's expression suggested the same skepticism I'd seen from the triage nurse, and her questions became more specific as she continued the physical assessment. "The impact pattern suggests significant force from a perpendicular angle," she observed. "Are you sure you just fell downstairs?" The injury profile looks more consistent with blunt force trauma from a direct collision. Her medical expertise was identifying inconsistencies between my explanation and the evidence presented by my injuries, creating pressure to either provide more believable lies or acknowledge the truth about Michael's assault. The temptation to confess everything was overwhelming, but family loyalty and fear of criminal consequences continued to outweigh honesty. I hit the wall really hard, I elaborated, hoping that additional details about the impact might satisfy her concerns. The stairs are concrete, and I was carrying laundry that threw off my balance. Dr. Foster made notes while ordering x-rays that would reveal the precise nature and extent of skeletal damage, but her manner indicated continued doubt about the circumstances I was describing. Jessica, she said, using my first name in ways that suggested a shift toward more personal conversation, I need you to know that we see injuries like yours fairly regularly, and they're not always caused by accidents. If there's anything else about your situation that I should know, this is a safe place to discuss it. The invitation was clear, and the kindness in her voice almost broke through my determination to protect Michael from the consequences of his actions. For a moment, I considered telling her everything about his addiction, his break-in, his assault, and his current threats about obtaining money. But the image of him sitting in the waiting room, desperate and dangerous and still my brother despite everything, prevented complete honesty. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but it really was just an accident. I'm probably being overly cautious coming in for examination, but the pain was concerning enough that I wanted professional assessment. Dr. Foster accepted my statement while her expression indicated she remained unconvinced, and her documentation would likely reflect suspicions about the true cause of my injuries. We'll get those x-rays and see exactly what we're dealing with, she said. I'll also want to monitor you for a few hours to watch for signs of internal complications. The mention of extended observation created new anxiety about Michael's reaction to delays in his plans for obtaining money from me. His already fragile mental state would likely deteriorate further if he perceived that hospital staff were deliberately interfering with his objectives through unnecessary medical procedures. The X-ray technician, a cheerful young man who tried to maintain casual conversation while positioning me for various imaging angles, provided temporary distraction from worries about Michael's growing impatience in the waiting room. The procedure required holding uncomfortable positions that sent fresh spikes of pain through my damaged ribs, but the discomfort was manageable compared to the emotional distress of the ongoing family crisis. Looks like you really did a number on yourself, the technician commented while reviewing the digital images on his computer screen. Good thing you came in for evaluation, instead of trying to tough it out at home. His casual remark suggested that the x-rays had revealed significant damage, probably confirming Dr. Foster's suspicions about the severity of trauma required to create my injury pattern. The medical evidence would speak for itself regardless of whatever explanation I continued to provide about falling downstairs. Dr. Foster's expression when she returned with the x-ray results confirmed that my injuries were more serious than I'd realized during the initial adrenaline rush of Michael's assault. You have 2 fractured ribs and significant soft tissue damage, she reported while displaying the images on a computer monitor. You're fortunate that the bone fragments didn't puncture your lung, but this level of trauma typically requires several weeks of recovery time. The diagnosis was sobering but not unexpected given the force of Michael's attack and the concrete surface I'd hit during our confrontation. What concerned me more than the physical damage was the medical documentation that would now exist, creating an official record of injuries that didn't match my fabricated explanation about accidental falls. I'm going to prescribe pain medication and recommend strict rest for at least the next week, Dr. Foster continued. But Jessica, I need to emphasize that injuries this severe rarely result from simple household accidents. If your living situation is unsafe in any way, we have resources available to help you. Her persistence in offering assistance suggested that my story wasn't convincing anyone with medical training, but I continued to maintain the deception out of misguided loyalty to a brother whose addiction had made him capable of violence against his own family. Thank you for the concern, but I'll be fine once I get home and can rest properly, I replied, hoping to conclude the medical evaluation before Michael's impatience led to some kind of disruptive incident in the waiting room. Dr. Foster made additional notes while preparing discharge instructions that would guide my recovery process, but her manner indicated she remained troubled by the inconsistencies between my explanation and the medical evidence. "I'm required to file a report about suspicious injury patterns," she said carefully. "But I want you to know that my primary concern is your health and safety." The mention of official reports created new anxiety about potential investigations that might complicate Michael's already precarious legal situation. But there was nothing I could do to prevent medical professionals from following established protocols for documenting suspicious injuries. "I understand," I said, accepting the prescription and discharge papers while hoping to expedite my return to the waiting room before Michael's behavior attracted unwanted attention from hospital security personnel. The walk back to the waiting area took longer than expected due to the mobility limitations created by my fractured ribs, giving me time to observe Michael's condition through the security windows that separated the treatment area from public spaces. His agitation had clearly escalated during my absence, and his pacing, muttering, and frequent phone checking were beginning to concern other patients and visitors. When I finally emerged from the secure treatment area, Michael immediately approached with questions delivered in rapid-fire sequence that demonstrated how anxiety had affected his already compromised cognitive function. "What did they say? How long until you're better? Did you tell them anything about our family situation? When can we go to the bank?" His focus on financial rather than medical concerns revealed how completely addiction had altered his priorities, making my physical welfare secondary to his need for money to purchase drugs. The brother who'd once worried about every scraped knee and childhood illness had been replaced by someone who viewed my serious injuries primarily as obstacles to his substance abuse objectives. "2 fractured ribs," I reported, while moving carefully toward the exit. "Pain medication and rest for several weeks. We need to go home, so I can begin recovery." Michael's reaction to news about extended recovery time was predictably self-centered, focusing on how my medical needs would interfere with his plans rather than expressing appropriate concern for my condition. "Several weeks?" he repeated incredulously. "I don't have several weeks to wait around while you heal from a minor accident. I need money now, today, before my situation gets worse." His characterization of fractured ribs as a minor accident demonstrated how addiction had eliminated his capacity for empathy and realistic assessment of other people's needs. The combination of drug withdrawal, sleep deprivation, and mounting desperation had created a person who was incapable of considering anyone's welfare except his own immediate chemical requirements. "Michael, I can barely walk right now," I said, hoping that visual evidence of my mobility limitations might help him understand the impracticality of his demands. "Banking, driving, any kind of physical activity is going to be extremely difficult for the next few days, at minimum." This practical obstacle to his plans triggered fresh anger that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain in public settings where other people might observe his erratic behavior. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Then we'll figure out other ways to get what I need. Credit cards, online banking, whatever works with your current condition." The drive home passed in tense silence, broken only by Michael's muttered complaints about hospital inefficiency and his increasingly elaborate plans for extracting money from my various financial accounts. Each bump in the road sent new jolts of pain through my damaged ribs, while his aggressive driving style suggested that patience was not among his remaining personality traits. Back at our townhouse, the domestic normalcy of Daniel's coffee mug and breakfast dishes felt surreal after the violence and medical crisis of the past few hours. Michael immediately began searching through drawers and cabinets, apparently looking for checkbooks, credit cards, or other financial materials that might facilitate his money-gathering objectives. "Where do you keep your banking information?" he demanded while ransacking our home office with the systematic thoroughness of someone experienced in searching other people's property for valuable items. "Michael, stop," I said, the pain medication beginning to take effect but not enough to eliminate the sharp discomfort that accompanied every movement. "You can't just take our financial information and expect to access accounts without proper authorization procedures." His response demonstrated how addiction had eliminated his understanding of legal and practical boundaries that govern normal financial transactions. "I'm not stealing anything," he insisted while continuing to search through our personal papers. "You're going to help me access the money voluntarily, just like you should have done months ago when I first asked for help." This reframing of extortion as voluntary assistance represented another example of how chemical dependency had corrupted his ability to perceive reality accurately. From his perspective, my resistance to his demands was unreasonable selfishness, rather than appropriate self-protection against criminal behavior. The sound of Daniel's car in our driveway created a moment of terror, as I realized that Michael's presence would put my husband in immediate danger from someone whose mental state had deteriorated beyond any predictable boundaries. Daniel would walk into our home expecting normal domestic tranquility, and instead encounter a violent, desperate person whose addiction had made him capable of attacking his own family. "That's Daniel," I said, hoping to convince Michael to leave before the situation escalated into a three-way confrontation that could result in even more serious injuries or criminal charges. Michael's reaction was immediate and violent, grabbing a kitchen knife while positioning himself near the door where Daniel would enter. "Perfect," he said, his voice taking on the cold tone that had preceded his assault on me. "Now we have more leverage to work with." The implications of his statement were terrifying, suggesting that he viewed Daniel as a hostage whose safety could be used to force my compliance with financial demands. The situation had progressed from family crisis to genuine criminal activity that endangered everyone involved. "Michael, please don't hurt him," I begged, the pain from my fractured ribs nothing compared to the terror of imagining violence against my husband. "Daniel has nothing to do with this. He's never done anything except try to help our family." "Daniel represents everything I've lost," Michael replied, his voice filled with resentment that had apparently been building throughout months of observing our happy marriage while his own life disintegrated. "The job, the house, the normal life, the respect from our parents. He gets to have everything, while I get nothing." This twisted logic that blamed Daniel for Michael's addiction-related losses revealed how completely drugs had distorted his understanding of cause and effect. Daniel hadn't caused any of the problems that resulted from Michael's choices, but addiction required external targets for anger and resentment that couldn't be directed towards substances without threatening the chemical dependency that had become his primary relationship. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.